Support for Lab Out Loud is brought to you by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And in today's show, we're going to be looking at genome editing technology. Will we be seeing technology like CRISPR in our science classrooms?
The technology is interesting specifically because it doesn't need the same level of sophistication in your training or in your facilities as many of the other kinds of biology experiments have needed in the past. I think that you're going to be looking at high school students in their biology laboratory classes doing things with genome editing in the next few years. And I think it's going to move down to junior high school science classes pretty quickly as well.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And before we get started in today's show, Brian's got some listener mail to share.
I feel like we should have some kind of like listener mail jingle or something.
Listener mail.
Something. All right. Okay. So we got this message at the end of August. It reads, "Hi guys, I've just heard your School in Prison podcast, which you did some shout outs to teachers that listened, all of which were from the United States. Just wanted to know that you have some listeners in Sydney too. We found you through the membership of NSTA.
Well, that's awesome. Well, we'll give a shout out to Alistair, right? Alistair Walker.
So this is Alistair Walker, and he's down under in Sydney, and that's great to hear. We'd love to hear that people have been listening, obviously from the classroom and beyond, way beyond.
Yes.
It's
winter there.
Southern Hemisphere, Eastern. I'm impressed. So thanks for the message there. If you have some feedback that you'd like to give to us from anywhere you are in the world, or anyone on the space station, I would appreciate a message too. I don't want to be, Earth-centric here, but...
well, they're dealing with the hole, right? Isn't there a hole in the space station?
Yes, right now they've got some other things pressing. But, we'd love to hear from anyone, anywhere who listens to the show and what you think of our show, what you would like to see on the show. If you have some ideas, please forward them to us. If you have a way to record your message as an audio clip, you may send it to us as well. So there's a way to contact us on the Lab Out Loud webpage, and we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, we talked to Alistair, who is listening from far, far away. Let's move closer to home and something that's near and dear to ourselves, which is our genes, more specifically genome editing and how it fits into the science curriculum. That's our topic of the day, and it takes me back to my biology teacher in 10th grade. This would be like 1989, 90, Mr. Sager. I remember him telling the class, sort of like in the future, parents will sit down with a catalog and page through and look out and pick out. And I think it's funny because it was 2000. It's funny because he's predicting catalogs because we didn't think of the internet back then.
Yeah.
As a possibility. So you go through and then you would pick out the characteristics you want for your child. I want him to be a basketball player and those kinds of things. I remember him telling me that in a biology class. And now we got like genome editing and CRISPR being discussed and things like that being sort of like hinted at in different television shows and blockbuster movies and things like that. So this has got to be on our students' radar, got to be probably on their parents' radar. And this is probably a subject that they're going to be either talking about now or they're going to be talking about soon.
That's right. And I talked about when my experience in high school is similar to yours. Recombinant DNA technology was going to be all the rage, and we were going to have designer babies and cure genetic disorders back then, and we didn't quite get that far, but we might be closer than we think.
Is it the flying car of biology?
The flying car of biology. It very well could be. So anyway, to help us out with all of this, today's guest is Alta Charo. She's the Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison.
Hey, that's our neck of the woods.
Yeah, I was about to say that's near us. And actually, I did hear Alta speak once, and we realized, she was at one of our local science conferences. And sometimes I know that we dig into some local people, but I want to share some of our local talent with the world. I think that she's got some fantastic points to listen to about this content there. So. How does a law professor know so much about biology? Well, let's find out.
From the time I was in junior high school, I found myself drawn equally to social science and natural science. And it was great because it was a time in the 1960s and 70s when there was a lot of conversation around things like eugenics, race, equality, and nature versus nurture. So when I took my biology degree, I actually took along with it a number of courses on biology and social issues. So the move to law school was fairly natural. I wanted to use the biology for a kind of advocacy or activist career rather than as a laboratory career.
So that was a few decades ago. Do you still see those career pathways happening now?
I absolutely do. In fact, even more so now than before. I think that where you might say the 20th century was kind of the age of physics and engineering, I think the 21st century is the age of biology. And understanding biology, human biology, environmental biology is really important if you want to do anything, including work that has to do with human rights and social justice. It underlies how we manipulate our environment, how we get our food, how we make our food, how we regulate our bodies, and how we have children. Everything that you might think of as being a social issue now has a biological component.
Mm-hmm. I remember, what is that quote? Physics is science, everything, and then everything else is stamp collecting. Who said that? I know as a physics. I was thinking about that the other day, thinking, I wonder if they'd be impressed with the way that biology has taken a turn towards the molecular end of things. Would we still be considered stamp collecting?
Yeah, no. So 18th and 19th century biology had a lot of descriptive work. Simply cataloging what was around us was a major undertaking, and actually, we're still doing that. We have some very prominent scientists who are doing things like sailing boats around the world, simply trying to collect and classify all the different microorganisms in our oceans that we didn't even know were there. And it's valuable information. You may call it stamp collecting, but it's from those samples that we learn about how it is that genes and the epigenetics of genetics affect how we present ourselves, whether as microbes or as human beings. And that's what gives us the power to manipulate it. So that in the future we can imagine buildings that are covered with an organic skin that reacts to sunlight and heat, so you don't need as much air conditioning and you don't need as much electricity. Or parks where the grass will glow at night so you don't need lights, or any other kind of wacky thing you can imagine. But it comes first from understanding.
It would be like if Elon Musk was a biologist.
Yes. In fact, I'm surprised he hasn't turned his hand to it yet.
Yeah, no kidding.
Maybe he has, and there'll be some major announcements coming up soon.
So you got the law degree. So tell us a little bit about your current role.
Well, in law school,
I know that's a big jump from law degree to now.
In law school, I managed to take every possible course that had a law and science connection, but the goal then had been to do environmental law. The early 1970s was the kind of golden era of environmental legislation. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, these really basic things that were being adopted under President Nixon, actually. Mm-hmm. And I intended to do that. I got myself working in that field. But when I went to work for Congress with the expectation of working on genetic engineering in the environment, I got traded like a baseball player to the reproductive technologies team. And so wound up for the next 25 years wandering through human reproduction until I finally got back, interestingly enough, to the broader range of environmental applications. So now I'm a professor. I teach at the law school. I just relinquished a joint appointment at the medical school for budgetary reasons. And I teach courses on biotechnology regulation, on bioethics, on public health law, and then torts, which is the law of personal responsibility for the first-year law students.
That's amazing, because I remember back when I was in high school, Jurassic Park had just been released as a movie, and this was an exciting time thinking about what was going to happen in genetic engineering. And I was kind of enthralled by that possibility as well. And when I applied to colleges, I put down genetic engineering as something I wanted to look into. And I got all these pamphlets back on just standard engineering. And I think it wasn't quite ready. Yeah, the field wasn't quite ready yet. And so I didn't really go down that path. I went down with a biology major, and I learned what I could, of course. But that was the promise, is that genetic engineering was just around the corner, and then it wasn't. And are we at that point now?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, it was the early 1970s when we had the Asilomar Conference, which was the first kind of, how to put this? It was the first gathering to try and figure out what to do with recombinant DNA to make it valuable for research, but not potentially dangerous for the environment. And I do think we do have these really crucial points. I think that the stem cell work from about 20 years ago and the National Academy's report that we put out based on that was another one of those disconnect points where we really were beginning to think about a new concept of therapeutics having to do with regenerating ourselves as opposed to just treating what's there or cutting out what's there. I think that CRISPR and actually the earlier forms of editing, talons and zinc finger nucleases, they are all another disconnect point. Now it's not just about trying to regenerate what's there. It's about being able to alter what's there and then grow it as needed. And these are really fundamental changes in how we think about the level or the range of powers that we have at our disposal.
Now, when your law students come to your class to talk about these subjects, do they have to acquire a background in biology to have that conversation? Or are they coming with that already as a prerequisite?
It's not a prerequisite. You do need to understand some biology to appreciate some of the more subtle regulatory issues. But the law students come with a wide range of backgrounds.
Okay.
And so I have identified some online biology and genetics courses that people can take that give them the basics that they need in order to have a level playing field when we start on the first day. And I also spent a lot of time going through the most important aspects of the basic biology of these technologies before I move into some of the questions about policy and regulation. So they're reminded about this as well.
When we think about students, our students start at, kindergarten and, make their way all the way up to high school and then head on to college. Where do you see the conversation about CRISPR? Where's a good starting point? Do we wait till college, or can it happen sooner, and how much sooner?
Or does it need to happen sooner?
I think it's already happening sooner. I think that you're going to be looking at high school students in their biology laboratory classes doing things with genome editing in the next few years. And I think it's going to move down to junior high school science classes pretty quickly as well. The technology is interesting specifically because it doesn't need the same level of sophistication in your training or in your facilities as many of the other kinds of biology experiments have needed in the past.
Oh,
so it's more amenable, right? It's more amenable to a junior high school setting. But I think that even more than that, I think we need to start from the very beginning in elementary school with making sure that children grow up with this appreciation of a whole variety of things, of genetic diversity, of the fact that we are different from one another in many ways, but that we also have very fundamental commonalities, not only among humans, but between humans and animals and the environment. And it sets them up to appreciate this kind of underlying structure of life and our embeddedness in the rest of the life forms on this planet, as well as beginning to understand that you have some power to manipulate it. And that I think gets them ready for the idea that you can play around with this stuff.
So many science teachers have probably already taught about how we've used selective breeding all the way through, even some classical recombinant DNA technology, like insulin is a classic example, to change our environment already and change the organisms and the products that we consume or rely upon pharmaceutically. That's happened. But is CRISPR fundamentally different?
No, I don't think it's fundamentally different in concept that we can make changes and adapt things to our needs or change them so that they're less toxic to us. I think the only reason why CRISPR has made such an impression on the public is because of its power to decentralize science. The fact that it is easier to do by a wider range of people with fewer sophisticated facilities means that just a broader range of people can participate in using this and doing science. And that decentralizes. Think of it this way. Used to be that if you wanted to make a movie, you had to go and become a director in Hollywood. Now anybody can make a movie. Started with video cams, and then it moved on to any number of gizmos today, and you can then use YouTube or other kinds of social media to promote what you've done. It's made everybody into a potential filmmaker, and that has changed the nature of video entertainment. And it has wrested control of it from a very small number of Hollywood studios and allowed for a blossoming of things across the internet, as well as for an incredible uptick in stuff that's really not worth watching, right? You get the good with
absolutely.
the bad.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's the nature of CRISPR. Is it going to decentralize science, make it possible to synthesize new kinds of organisms or change existing ones in myriad ways, good, bad, and indifferent, by a wider range of people? It's more difficult to govern because you don't just have a limited number of identified labs to worry about. You need to think about everybody. That also has really a fundamental change in how we think about the governance of science. So it's not the underlying power that's changed so much as the implication of broadening its availability.
What do you think are some possible obstacles that our science teachers might face addressing CRISPR in the classroom?
Well, in the immediate future, I think it's the need to stay up to date. Just this morning, news was all over about a paper that just came out in Nature that identified a much wider range of so-called off-target effects, that is, alterations in parts of the genome that were not the parts you were trying to change. Now, next week, there's going to be a paper, I'm sure, that says, here's why that first paper is not quite right, or here's what you can do to avoid the effects the first paper identified.
Sure.
It's a very rapidly developing field. And so for the moment, assessing its safety, its applications, its benefits is a week-by-week kind of learning exercise.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm thinking like down the line, like let's say we have like a sophomore this coming year who's going to take biology, 10th grade. Stereotypically, it's not always the case.
I got two of those right now.
Yeah, you got two of those, right? So hopefully they're going to learn about CRISPR, something that's not in their textbook. And, like, okay, so what are the ramifications for them going forward, out of school, 3 years down the line after graduation from high school, or even down to college, or what kind of things do they need to know about CRISPR? Maybe just for being a citizen in the world, but maybe also if they want to pursue a career in science and maybe using CRISPR. That's a loaded question, I know.
That's a huge question.
That's all right. I think that there's, like most technologies, genome editing, and I'm going to use that phrase because CRISPR is only one way of doing it.
Sure.
Genome editing is a technology that has dual use potential. And what I mean by that is it has tremendous possible upsides for developing therapeutics. Last week's big news was about editing some of your cancer cells so that they begin attacking other cancer cells. That's phenomenal. Mm-hmm. Or thinking about editing a cell, editing a stem cell so that it now can be used to create real cultured meat from a couple of cells taken from a cow. No more herds, no more animal cruelty.
You're going to have a but, aren't you?
This is great stuff. Yes, but.
Yep, there you go.
It can also be used to take something dangerous, like a pathogenic virus or some other kind of pathogen, and make it more virulent, so it gets you sicker, or more easily transmissible, so that unlike mononucleosis, where you need very close contact, it's more like measles, where you just breathe in the same room as somebody with measles, you can catch it. They could make it more difficult to detect, more difficult to treat medically once you have it. So it is potentially a technology that could be used to create weapons.
Okay.
Now, it's not easy to do that, right? You not only have to change the pathogen, you have to figure out how to so-called weaponize it and deliver it in a way where the evil person doesn't wind up committing suicide in the process. But dual use is a fundamental challenge. And whether you go into biology and need to be aware of the potential dual use of your work that you're doing at the bench, or the information that you're putting out in public when you publish a paper, or you're a lawyer or other kind of social science person who's thinking about how you govern technologies, how do you make it possible to have progress and fairly share scientific information without creating a cookbook for somebody who wants to weaponize? This is what you need to appreciate, the dual use nature of this, but truly of most all technologies.
My mind is still spinning a little bit on thinking that we might see middle school students or junior high students doing this in the classroom laboratory. And I think about like a lot of middle schools around us, they've taken away a lot of chemicals, and they've taken, like even vinegar, you have to have like a permission. What kind of permission slips and parent kind of information do we need to do, CRISPR gene editing and genome editing?
Yeah, the parents are going to be like, what do you mean gene editing? That could be... Who's genes?
I believe that I think high school students are already participating in this annual synthetic biology competition that's run out of MIT. And so we've already seen some people doing very sophisticated work. They're already beginning to look at adding editing to the other techniques they use in order to synthesize organisms in that competition. So I think the future is now.
Yeah. I imagine, like, when I first taught high school science, high school biology, some of those students are now parents, and I've even run into them in my own district and as parents in my own district. And, they have students that they're going to be starting to enter into that 10th grade biology. And I'm hoping that I prepared them to at least think about gene editing back then, but this is a huge new world for them now. And I think about the parents. What do parents need to know about as their students are coming home with this information?
I think the parents need to know that the schools have a system for figuring out what is appropriate and what is not, and how to have the appropriate kinds of protections. You don't want students making things that might be environmentally problematic, for example. But that means having a good relationship with your school boards and understanding how sophisticated they are about the changes in the biology curriculum. I personally can't speak to that because I haven't had involvement with school boards lately, but I know that you did, and you do. So that's going to be a challenge because a lot of those boards are made up of parents who don't necessarily understand any biology at all.
Or they could be working directly against you. I mean, we've dealt with this for other topics in biology, for example, where they're working directly against you. They just don't want any piece of it. So sometimes we encounter unwillingness to listen, period.
Yeah, I will say this, that the politics around genetic manipulation is tricky because in some versions of it, it is going to be problematic for those who have a very fundamentalist approach to certain religions, particularly Christianity, and who are uncomfortable with anything that smacks of undue human powers that ought to belong to God. And at the same time, there's often some resistance from people who are not coming out of a religious background. They come out of the far left, almost a kind of spiritualist background that has an emotional attachment to nature and what is natural, like the philosopher Habermas, and assume that what is not natural somehow is more likely to be dangerous and not good. So you might get resistance from both ends depending on what exactly you're asking the students to do.
Sure.
Well, before we leave you, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're starting in the new school year right now, and teachers are probably getting into, maybe cells and some other things if they're teaching biology. But what kind of resources are available for a teacher who wants to know more about CRISPR and the potential bioethics around it?
Well, interestingly, right now, there are a couple of large reports that can get them up to speed very quickly. Now, the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine released a report. I co-chaired it with Dr. Richard Hines from MIT, and we had a 20-person international committee working with us that came out in February of 2017, and it spends a lot of time explaining the basics of genome editing and what to watch for in terms of risks and benefits, and then spends many chapters going through many of the ethical arguments for and against its uses in different settings, whether it's to cure something, to prevent a disease, to so-called enhance, right, make somebody more muscular, and then most controversially, to use it to try and alter your children in a way that might, for example, prevent a disease. Now, the Nuffield Council in the United Kingdom is putting out its own report on the ethics and governance of genome editing for both somatic, that is, your existing body, and germline, your eggs and sperm, your gametes kind of editing. And they also go through the ethics of it in great length. So these are great resources because they collect a lot of information for you and summarize it.
What about states? Have states, when we talked about like local school boards and things like that, are there any states that are addressing this, maybe in their science curriculum adoption, things like that?
I don't know.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you heard of anything.
About curriculum planning. There's one aspect of genome editing which focuses on the editing of embryos, human embryos, with the eye eventually toward being able to correct a devastating genetic disease that would appear once the child is born by editing at the embryonic stage. That might be illegal in some states that actually have prohibitions on research with human embryos.
Oh, I see.
And that could pose a problem. But most areas of genome editing research are not the subject particularly of state regulation or interest. It's really at the federal level with federal laws that require a whole variety of oversight bodies to make sure that it's done safely.
Sure.
Do you anticipate that might come in the future, like a big, large hand slamming down and, bring us into a Handmaid's Tale world where we're just going to stop doing this and this is illegal?
Right now, we already have a functional prohibition on research that would aim toward doing these germline edits to ensure that a child is not born with a known genetic disease. And the reason is that to do that, something that involves transferring an edited embryo to a woman's body for pregnancy and birth is something that is treated as if it were transplantation kind of medicine. It's called cell and tissue therapy. And that's regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which is federal. And Congress has prohibited the Food and Drug Administration from even entertaining a proposal to try this. So unless that is changed, it's technically a budgetary limitation, but unless that gets dropped in the next budget round, and I don't see that it will, we will not have the ability in the United States to do that. So you'd be able to do the research on the embryos in the states where it's legal, but you would never be able to try to then take the next step and bring a child to term who's now freed of that disease. That's going to happen someplace else.
Where?
A different country.
I think it's going to happen in the UK.
Really?
And I think it's going to happen there for a variety of reasons. Number one, because they've already shown themselves over the years to be willing to engage in activities that in the United States are so politically controversial that we tend to steer away from them. That includes IVF in its early years in vitro fertilization, then variety forms of embryo research, more recently a very special form of embryo editing having to do with mitochondrial DNA replacement, and now I think they will eventually also allow for so-called germline editing. And they have already a very robust regulatory structure that has tight control over who can do it, which clinics can do it, and for which reasons. A control that may be so tight that it wouldn't be constitutional in the United States, but it is there, permissible. And so it gives the public a great deal of confidence that this is not some kind of technology that's run rampant.
So are we far behind? Do we need to catch up in this area?
I don't think we need to catch up in this area because I don't think it matters where it's done first, provided it's done in a responsible jurisdiction, which is why doing it first, if it happens in the UK, is fine.
Okay.
What I don't look forward to is seeing it done in an unregulated environment where you don't know that it's being done in a way that has met basic safety requirements. You don't want to make a mistake when you're talking about editing that either is going to affect an adult or a future child. You don't want to make a mistake. And so the unregulated environments with no oversight, no independent opinion to kind of put some kind of control over what might be an overly enthusiastic researcher or patient. Those are dangerous, those unregulated environments.
So I guess that's what I mean. Do we need to have a better regulatory process to ensure that that happens the correct way here in the United States?
Well, we actually do have that regulatory process. We have it with regard to somatic, that is editing. Let's say you're an adult and I want to do some edits in you to help treat your cancer. We already have clinical trials going down that path. They are well regulated based on risk and benefit by the Food and Drug Administration. And if Congress removed the limitation, the Food and Drug Administration would also be able to bring that robust regulatory environment to germline or inheritable changes. In the environmental area, we also have extensive regulation. So it's not that we need to catch up on the regulatory environment. I think we need to catch up on the political environment.
Okay. And so we need more people taking a biology degree and then taking it somewhere else.
Well, personally, I think that would be terrific. I think that the law schools, it's important to know law schools have started looking hard for students who come in with some science background, whether it's biology, physics, chemistry. It's a set of skills that encompasses a way of thinking, a kind of logical progression in thinking that's incredibly important in law generically. But also it brings a body of information that's really quite relevant to the upcoming challenges we're facing, whether it's the law of outer space and planetary exploration, the law that governs the opening waters of the Arctic and Antarctic due to climate change, or the law that involves international governance over carbon outputs because we want to stop or slow climate change. So having a science background is a real plus if you want to move into anything that has to do with social issues, whether through law or some other degree.
Awesome.
That's a fantastic point because, I know that we've talked a lot about careers and potential careers on this show, but a lot of them are very, they're very scientific at their heart, not necessarily having a science background to pursue other careers. And so I think that's a great point. And
well, it makes me think of right before the school year, I think it's Beloit always has the students coming into college.
Oh yeah.
Never saw, have always had YouTube, or, when I think about our students that, we start with the kindergartners, what is that, 2031, they're going to graduate high school.
Wow.
I know. So, just thinking about these conversations, we're certainly just getting started, but then you go to that classroom and look at some of those young children saying, oh, let's make that world for them. The one we want them, I don't know. It's just kind of fun to think fast forward of their little lives.
No, I love the idea because, in fact, we now have more power than ever before to actually decide what kind of world to leave them.
Awesome.
So I think I'm just hoping we're smart enough to make good decisions.
Us too.
I agree. I took a big breath there, but yes, I hope so too.
It's like I feel like we have homework now.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alta.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.